Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content. You guys really seem to enjoy the TikToks and shorts, so we'll continue to pump those out to you. The NBA in-season tournament group play is now over, and we can, officially look ahead to the knockout round for the NBA Cup. I think it's going to be really exciting. And then once again, we appreciate all the support, and please continue supporting us by liking this video and subscribing and following us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so once again, we had some wild in-season tournament games
Yeah.
over the course of the last Tuesday, I believe, basically since we last spoke on this podcast. So, we'll first start off, with the games before we kind of go into, the actual next step. But, we'll go over some of them because some of them, like, don't really have to be talked about a whole lot, but we'll go over the ones that, are kind of interesting. But either
Yeah.
way, Bulls Celtics, that one pretty much an atrocity for the Bulls, right?
Yeah.
Don't need to say a whole lot there. The main highlight of the game was the fact that down the stretch they were intentionally fouling Andre Drummond to make sure that that point differential was okay, because that's kind of a part, an important part of the in-season tournament. Because there were
Mhm.
situations, scenarios where teams had to win by certain amounts, in order to stay in. And the Celtics were able to pull that off. And then, at the same time, I think they had mentioned that they were watching one of the other ones, which was important because that would determine kind of like, whether or not they would be in there, like, the game between the Nets and the Raptors, right? Where I believe if the Nets had lost, right, then I think Orlando would have made it in there instead of Boston, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Um, so, just, some really cool parts of the in-season tournament. Obviously, I think some things will probably need to be tweaked, and I think they'll probably need to do a little bit better of a job explaining some of the other stuff like the point differential. But overall, it's been a really good success.
Yeah.
And then Hawks Cavs, right? That was kind of another, you know, middling game, right? Obviously, the Hawks, we didn't talk about it in the last podcast, but Jalen Johnson, who had been, like a really key part of, Atlanta's team, right? He took a huge step forward in his third season, right? He's obviously been out, and he's going to be out, I believe, for the next 4 to 6 weeks, right, with
Yeah.
a wrist injury, and he was, playing basically the best basketball of his career, right? He was averaging 14 and 7 with 2 assists, 59 from the field, 42 and a half from three, right? So obviously his, all around versatile game will be missed, right? And it just hasn't, unfortunately, been that great for them as of late. So, um, that's pretty rough. And then Bucks Heat, right? That was one of the nationally televised games. This game was actually very back and forth, very competitive.
Mhm.
The Bucks did end up pulling it out 131-124. There was no Jimmy Butler or Tyler Hero for the Miami Heat, but they were still able to kind of, stay in the game and hang around. Just by making a lot of timely plays. The Bucks offense ultimately kind of caught fire, so it was too much for Miami, which is kind of the template, the template for the, Bucks this season in terms of like, we're going to win by outscoring teams. We'll try to get some stops when we can, but we know that that's kind of not really their MO right now. Middleton, I thought, he was kind of an unsung hero, right? Obviously, Lillard and Giannis will get most of the shine because they were, the two best guys on the floor. But Middleton had some plays late, right, where he hit, this fadeaway corner shot right at the end of the clock, and then
Yeah.
also like he had a one-on-one possession right where he hit like a tough fadeaway. Um, so it's good to see that he's kind of figuring some stuff out on offense. His defense, I think, is definitely not where it used to be. But just being able to have another guy, right, and where you can slide him into that third role, and he can kind of take advantage of weaker defenders being on him while still being. I mean, he's still good, but you know what I mean. Like now
Sure.
he's not as much of a focal point, on the perimeter now that Lillard's there. So they're still winning games. They're 13-5, so not a whole lot to complain about there, right? Obviously, they've been in a lot of close games that probably shouldn't have been close, and that's because they can't stop anybody. But
Yeah.
again, they still keep finding ways to win. So at the very least, you have to be pleased about that.
Yeah. For me, I'm a little bit on the opposite end with Milwaukee. I think they're on fraud watch right now. But the Middleton, comeback, I guess, is something that's kind of easing my mind in terms of that. Because, like you said, it's really nice to see him actually getting some buckets. And hopefully, Klay Thompson can get to that point as well. Because I'm sure we'll talk about, the Warriors later. But yeah, I think Giannis played an amazing game. And this just shows you the real potential of this team offensively. They can attack you at all three levels now. Defense still a big issue because, I mean, we're talking about a Miami Heat that was hobbled pretty much, like you said. And they weren't really. I mean, well, looking at it, they shot 51% from the field and then also shot really well from the three. And I think that's something that Miami is kind of good at, like, in terms of when they're on, they're very on. Like, they're a very streaky team. So when they're shooting the three and they're making it, like, it's very hard to stop them. But when they're not making it, it's pretty easy to stop them. They kind of stop themselves. But in terms of Milwaukee, I do like what I've seen in terms of the offense. But defensively, still giving me some scares. And especially on the bench, I don't really like how thin they are defensively on the bench. It's not the greatest. And honestly, even offensively, sometimes it's hard to watch the bench. It seems like the bench, when they come in, tend to let things go a little bit on the leads if they have a lead, but they don't normally lead a lot of games. But in general, I'm not really sure where I land on this team right now. For me, it is fraud watch, but I will say Giannis, Middleton playing better, and obviously Dame playing very good basketball does ease my mind a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's the thing is that right now you just kind of have to find ways to win and stay afloat in the standings. Until maybe by the trade deadline you might find some extra pieces that you can pull in. And then back to the Heat, like you said, because they're a very disciplined offensive team, right? In the sense of like they have a system that they like to run. It's all about finding guys that can fit in and adapt to the system, right? Jaquez Jr., right? Obviously, he's been playing a ton
Hmm.
as a rookie and he's fit in basically perfectly and he's done pretty much anything and everything that they've asked of him, right? From doing things such as like, battling on the boards to, maybe running some sets, knocking down some timely shots. That was a great pickup for them. And they haven't really missed a beat in terms of losing out on some of those guys. They just have to be healthy because that's kind of been the rough part for them is that, they've been losing guys, left and right. And then, in a game, as we're speaking right now, right, Bam had like a hip injury and he's
Yeah.
not going to play the rest of the game. So, that's kind of been the rough part for them is when they have all their guys, they've been pretty productive and, still kind of look like, a team that's going to be a problem come playoff time. But, we just haven't seen a whole lot of all their guys available, right? Because Hero, who played the early part of the season, he hasn't played in a while, right? Butler's kind of been in and out. Adebayo's been in and out. He's been playing great basketball, right? Basically career season for him. So
Yeah.
that's a good sign for them. Lowry still looks like, there are times where it looks kind of rough, but then there's other times where, he gives them a very steadying hand at that guard spot. So that's the main thing that I feel like for them, it would probably be ideal is if they can find sort of an upgrade at that point guard spot, then they'll probably be in a pretty good spot. It's just, a matter of can they find that and then which guys will they be comfortable with, moving on from.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah. And then like I said, you can see why they were very hesitant, to move on from Jaquez Jr. and
Yeah.
and like kind of throw him into a trade because again, he's been playing great basketball
Yeah,
for them.
he
So
seems really poised, and it seems like he knows what he's doing. Very seasoned experience, and I think that comes with not being a one and done. I think that's the advantage that you do have. It's just you may have a little bit of a shorter career than some other players, just because you're a little bit older.
and then moving on, Knicks Hornets, not much to say there.
Yeah,
It was a blowout, right? Obviously, Lamelo Ball, right? He's gonna be out for a while, and
yeah.
it's kind of been a rough, stretch, for Charlotte, where it seemed like they were starting to figure some stuff out. He was starting to play really good, but the injury bug is just catching up to them again. The
Hmm.
Knicks, they pulled out the win and they blew him out, so they're moving on to the next round. Even though they didn't even really do that amazing in the in-season tournament, but
No.
they did just enough, to be able to move on. So good for them. Then you had Minnesota and Oklahoma City, right, which was a game that was very back and forth. Despite the fact that early on Oklahoma City had the advantage, then Minnesota came back. Edwards got hurt and McDaniels was already out, right? So they were kind of in a dogfight where they were going against a pretty healthy Oklahoma City matchup. Down you know one of their best players and then obviously their best wing defender. So that's rough, but they were still able to close it out. With other guys, right? Like Troy Brown Jr. comes in and makes a lot of big plays for them, right? Obviously, Gobert, right, still flashing, the defensive chops that he's continued to show,
Hmm.
right? Maybe a defensive player of the year guy this year. We'll see.
Maybe
Um,
you're doing well.
right, and yeah, and the Wolves keep finding ways to win, right? They're 8-1 at home, 13-4 overall, or I guess now maybe 13-5 or something like that. But regardless, they've been playing great basketball, and if you were somebody who liked them last year, like yourself, this is kind of like more of an envisioned version of
Yes.
like what you would want to see from them in terms of like now you got Edwards, even though he's hurt, right? He's been playing great this season. Towns has been playing better on both ends of the floor.
Yes.
And the defensive right chops, that's what you want to see from him because that's been a weakness for him. And then obviously Gobert, you're getting a better version of him than you did last year, right? Conley's been a steadying hand, right? McDaniels has gotten better, so it's definitely been a really good turnaround season for Minnesota, right? Because again, there were people where even though people still didn't like the trade, and I still think they gave up too much for Gobert, but at the very least, it's good to see at least right now, right? He's playing well. You just got to see what happens come playoff time, right? Because they still got to win, not the championship, obviously, but they can't go out in the first round,
Yeah.
like they did last year for me to feel like the trade was a success.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it seems like with the off season, another off season, and then another year to kind of figure out some kinks, it's been working better. I'm just curious to see if how they feel internally about it.
Yeah, because I think the problem with that move was that it was deemed a win now move, and then they kind of just flamed out like twice. So I do understand people not being as high on Minnesota last year, but I don't know. I just felt like that's where this is where they should have been last year. You know what I mean? I just feel like because I mean not much has changed in terms of the personnel, only a couple things, but in general, very pleased with what I've seen from Minnesota. Definitely great on both ends of the floor, like you said. And then Oklahoma City, this is a healthy OKC pretty much. So it is kind of interesting to see Minnesota pull this one out. Like you said, Anthony Edwards did get hurt, but we do have to commend Shea. I think he had a great game. 32 points kind of goes without saying at this point. And I mean, he just balls out every night. But yeah, for Minnesota, I think it'll be interesting come playoff time. I think that's when the real test will be because I think we all know that they're going to be great in the regular season at this point. I think they're so far ahead in terms of their wins and losses. I think, they're going to be a top seed in the West. Just depends on, are they going to pull a Memphis, like, flame out in the first round? Who knows what's going to happen. But in general, I think I've been very impressed, especially with Anthony Edwards. Hopefully he gets better. I hope that doesn't impact, their win-loss record as well.
Yeah, exactly. Because we'll see. Because again, Oklahoma City, right, they've been playing good basketball as well.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a younger, well, it's a very young team in
Yeah.
comparison to Minnesota, who does have some veterans. So there's still some warts over the course of the season where, like, both teams are going to win a lot of games. But, which one do you feel like is probably more likely to go far in the playoffs? I'm not sure. Because again, with Minnesota, you have more veterans, right? I think Oklahoma City probably, has like, a lot of other explosive guys, but at the same time, like, with Minnesota, we've seen them in the playoffs before
Yeah.
multiple times, and now Edwards is better, so we'll see.
Yeah,
But
I'd probably
either
go
way,
with Minnesota on that one.
yeah, and that's how I kind of feel at this point as well. It's just again, it's some of it is also just going to be matchup based, but either
Yeah.
way, it's a good story for both of those teams this season.
For sure.
And
For
then
sure.
moving on, right? Dallas, Houston, right? Dallas pulls it out. Right, Kyrie and Luca, right? Luca had 41, 9 and 9, right? Kyrie with 27 and 5, right? So obviously when those two guys are playing well, right, that's when this Dallas team, typically is at its best. And then the other role players, right, kind of chipping in, right? Derek Jones Jr. moved to the second unit, Josh Green in the starting five. Again, not much has changed in that regard, right? Again, like we know what happens with them where their defense hadn't been as great. It's been better as of late, and that's kind of probably, what has helped, pull out some of these wins. Um, but either way, right, Dallas continues to look like a solid team, and Houston, even though they lost, and obviously they also got blown out the other night by Denver. Either way, I feel like the direction that these teams are going in, you should feel pretty solid about. Because again, with Houston, they did win 6 in a row, and then it seems like they've kind of, I don't want to say flamed out, obviously, but they've sort of cooled off since
Mhm.
then. But either way, they're still miles ahead, better than what they were before. And then Dallas obviously is much better than they were last year. So obviously it's kind of a litmus test. I mean, Dallas has more high end talent. So I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
other part that kind of makes a big difference as well. But either way, I don't think Houston should be too mad at the result. Obviously, you're disappointed that you lost, but either way, again, they still look a lot better than last year. And again, like Şengün's also been a monster.
Yeah, like you said, Sengun's been crazy. Balling out. He had 31 points in this game. But the thing with Dallas, I think this is kind of the ideal situation, and I think this was a move that we kind of wanted, and we're questioning why it wasn't made earlier. With Green being in the starting lineup, we thought that he provided a little bit more. Although Jones Jr. he did bring a little bit of defense and some athleticism surrounding two guys that aren't maybe the best high flyers, in Kyrie and Luca. But I think this is a great game, or this was a great game to watch. Obviously, like you said, Luca, Kyrie doing their thing. But I think Dallas will probably go up in the standings. That's how I'm thinking. I think they're a team that's probably going to have streaks where they go up and down, just based on how they defend, and also if Kyrie can be a little bit more consistent, I think that's something that would be helpful too. Because I think Luca, we all know Luca can't do it by himself. That's been something that he's struggled with already in his young career. was having that second guy. But I think Kyrie can definitely be that guy if he's just more consistent. But overall, very pleased with what I saw from Dallas because that was another team that let me down horribly last year.
So, yeah, I mean, again, it's good to see the progress that's been made with Dallas, in terms of the moves they made in the offseason. Just getting, like you said, better players around, those two guys. And that was kind of the problem last year. Now they have more talent and now they're a better team.
Yeah.
Um, and then moving on to the game that was really the highlight of the night, right? And that was Warriors Kings. This was a game that, just in a way, it felt like a playoff game in regards to just, the energy. I mean, a lot of these have felt like it, but, this one in a way was actual playoff matchup last year,
Sure.
right? Where, the Warriors and Kings meet each other, right? Kind of a matchup of like an old team versus, a young team. And the Warriors were able to pull it out in the playoffs. But, this time around, yeah, this was not the case, right? This was a game where the Warriors came into the game with all their guys healthy, right? They were feeling good. I believe they needed to win by 12 or more in order to
Hmm.
advance into the next group or whatever.
Yeah.
So that would have been interesting, but then they ended up going up by as much as 24, in the first half, right? And then had like a little bit of a momentum swing where they made some bad plays, and then the Kings cut it to 17 at halftime. But still, it felt like a game that was still probably trending in the Warriors' direction. And then, the second half happened, and it wasn't so much the third quarter, although the third quarter, I mean, the Kings scored 40 points, much of it at the line, but the Warriors offensively still kind of held pace. It was really the fourth quarter where everything just kind of fell apart. Um, where just over time, some of the issues that have continued to be problems with Golden State, right? The turnovers, um, you know, fouling so much, right? And again, like I know that there's going to be fans that are going to complain about the officiating, but you got to remember this is a team that fouls a lot, right? This was a problem last year. It's been a problem for them for a while, right? When you're a small team, that's kind of where you have to overcompensate by fouling. And I mean, Sacramento did get a lot of free throws, and it did kind of slow down the game at
Mhm.
times, right? But I mean, at the same time, right? Like, I mean, if you're the Warriors, I mean, that's just a bad loss, like a really devastating loss where like you just kind of gave that one away. I mean, usually you always want to give credit to the team that won, right? Like the Kings pulled out the win, but also the Warriors definitely just blew this game, right? This was a game where, like I said, they were up by a significant amount. Just a lot of weird plays down the stretch, a lot of decisions by, everyone involved, right? Like the core guys, I thought made some really poor mistakes down the stretch, right? Steph was getting trapped, getting kind of blitzed, and then he would just kind of just give the ball away, right? They had two bad turnovers, right, in the last two possessions of the game
Mhm.
for them where Steph throws the ball to Malik Monk basically, and he gets a three. Then Draymond just does a bounce pass out of bounds, and then the Malik Monk hits the crazy game winner off the backboard over Wiggins.
Yeah.
Um, but it's rough, right? Because it was a game where Wiggins played very well, right? This was probably his best game of the season, right? Where he
Definitely
looked a
was.
lot much, yeah, where he looked a lot more like himself, right? He even had 10 rebounds, right, including like a tip in that put him up by 5, where it felt like a dagger play. But you got an okay game out of Clay. He wasn't great, but I think in terms of like a lot of the numbers, right? 20 points, 9 rebounds, didn't shoot great, 3 of 9, but this was a better game than we had seen at different points from Clay. So
Yeah.
you got decent performances out of those two guys, and you still ended up losing and finding a way to lose, right? Also, Chris Paul and Gary Payton the second both got hurt in the game, right? Paul, it looks like he's got a nerve injury in his leg. They
Yeah.
said he's going to be out for at least a couple of games, and then Gary Payton, Shams put out a torn calf and then an MRI, and then the Warriors team put out a strained calf.
Yeah.
Um,
I saw
and
torn.
both are, yeah, I was gonna say that's still not great. So that obviously means he's gonna be out for a little bit. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, that's just a rough loss. I mean, Kaminga, right? He plays 10 minutes, doesn't really do anything. Sarge, he was in there. He got some points, but also got points scored on. Um, I don't know. And then Draymond, right? He even had stretches, right, where he just had some really kind of unhinged possessions, right? Where I think he had a play where, he fell and it looked like he might have gotten hit. And then Steve Kerr was telling him to get up. And then in the replay, you can see that it was a flop. And then he got back up, right? And then later, I think he got a tech for calling like for doing the carry thing. But I feel like some of that was a makeup call for the flop.
Oh, for
Then he had
sure.
like another possession where he did like a weird foul on Malik Monk where he was just kind of like just all up in them, and it was an obvious foul, and they had to take him out of the game.
Yeah.
Um, and it was just very strange. Moses Moody, right? Steve Kerr made some mistakes, right? Moody was big in the fourth, and then he gets pulled. Had all of his points, I think, in the fourth quarter, right? Kind of helped keep them afloat while
Yeah.
Steph was all on the bench. And again, it just kind of harkened back to like a lot of the problems with the team from last year, where and they've always been a high turnover team. It's just now they don't have the same amount of talent to compensate them. I mean, that's another team where you kind of almost want to put them on fraud watch in a way, but
Oh,
like
they're on
also like
fraud
at the
watch for
same
me.
time, yeah, unlike the Bucks, their record's not even that great. So,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know. I mean, it was kind of weird because, going into the season, right, when I looked at, those Pacific Division teams, right, I thought that, the Warriors were kind of a safe pick to be decent, compared to some of the other teams, but they just have not looked very good other than the earlier portion of the season. And, I don't really know like what the obvious move is. I feel like I don't think they're going to trade any of their core guys. I think they're going to ride it out and those guys are going to be around until they retire, which is fine. But, it's just going to be weird because then that means they're probably going to have to get rid of some of those other young guys if they're going to make a move, right? Maybe Chris Paul, but at the same time, I think he's still been fine for their second unit. But, I don't know. Just and usually we tend to start off with the team that won, but just because of what happened, I mean, I feel like we have to start with the Warriors just in regards to just all the crazy stuff that happened in this game.
Yeah, I mean it is the Warriors. And they always bring a draw, but this was a really bad collapse. I mean, this was a master class sell. Like I don't think I've seen this in a long time. Um, but man, they just blew it completely. And I watched this game, and one thing that I did want to harp on for a second was the point differentials thing. I was actually watching this game with my mom, and she was like, what is going on? Like, why do they keep flashing the point differential? So, casuals and people who don't watch the NBA every night are confused. And I think that's something that they definitely need to work on for this in season tournament because I think that's going to scare a lot of people away. They're going to be like, what the heck is going on? But yeah, back to the performance in this game. I think the biggest thing that really hurt this team was really Chris Paul getting injured. He only played 5 minutes. I think it would have been
This was
nice. Huh? What'd you say?
this was a game where they could have used them, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, because you could see the bench was kind of restless. They didn't really have a sense of direction, calm, and poise. Even Gary Payton being out, that doesn't help. But like you said, Moses Moody kind of stepped in, filled in the shoes, but not enough. Because I feel like you could have put in like Podzemski, but I understand. He's a rookie, but I don't know. Sometimes I don't know. This team is so weird. Like it's hard to watch the Warriors because sometimes they're on where it's like Curry will put up like 35 and it's like all time performance masterclass. But then you have a disaster class where they just sell, blow up. But it's so weird because it seems like the problems, like with Wiggins and Clay, it didn't hurt them as much as the other games in the regular season. So I think this team might just be one of those where they're just sitting around 500 up and down the entire season until they figure if they figure something out. But I am glad to see that Wiggins had a great bounce back. I think this was something that we were all happy to see because I don't think we thought that he was cooked. I personally think Clay is cooked, but I think it's more so of a matter of consistency, and I think coaching is a really big aspect. I'm not saying that Kerr is overrated or anything, but he has been making some horrible mistakes. Like you said, bad rotational stuff, lack of challenges, but I do understand that with the timeouts thing, still, I would still, want to challenge some stuff, but kudos to the
Well,
Kings for
actually,
pulling this off.
yeah, I was gonna say before we get into the Kings,
Yeah,
actually, yeah, I didn't even mention the part where he had a bad challenge, I think,
yeah,
where got the offensive foul on the kick out, right? Where it was, pretty obvious that like there's
right,
no way that that's going to be overturned, and he
right.
challenged it anyways. And that was also their last time out. So then they went the last, however much time was left. I think it was like a couple minutes or something
Yeah,
without a timeout, right? So then it was like there'd be no opportunities to advance the ball, no opportunities to call a timeout, to like get a final play in, right?
yeah,
No opportunities, to call a timeout if somebody's like in trouble. And then it was just like, they got, Malik Monk made the shot. There was still time left, so they had a time, to call something, but there was no timeout, so they kind of just had to
they had
get
to
the
wing
ball
it.
up.
They had to wing it.
Yeah, kind of had to wing it, and it was not good. And I mean, they haven't been that good to me late in games for the most part
Sure.
since last season. I know early in the season, right, they were solid, right, because they had a couple of game winners, but it almost just feels kind of fluky at this point,
Yeah,
where
they can't
you
close.
know, yeah, maybe that early port and like you said, they were winning games early in the season while those guys weren't playing well. Now those guys are playing better than they were at the beginning of the season, but now they're losing. So
It doesn't make
that's
sense to
just
me.
right. So that's like I said, I just feel like that's probably just more, just predictive of there's some real issues with that squad where you probably are just gonna have to make some type of trade or else this might be a play-in team because again,
Yeah.
we're still kind of early, but at the same time, we're getting closer to the point where it's going to be a little bit harder to make up the ground. Where if you keep losing these games, and not that they're going to lose every game, right? But still, like you look at the top of the West, right? They're probably not going to be able to get up there. They were the sixth seed last year, right? And they were able to avoid the play-in by like what, one game. So I
Yeah.
mean, we'll see what happens now.
They
But
shouldn't
yeah,
be a
but
playing team because I think that would be probably the most expensive playing team of all time because there's no way, right? Like, I mean,
yeah, and
you can't
also
push for the luxury tax and be a playing team, in my opinion. I think that's just bad management.
just in a one game scenario, you just never know
Yeah.
what could happen, right? Because they were a playing team, what, 3 seasons ago or whatever, the year before they won the title,
Yeah.
and they were the eighth seed, and then they lost both playing games, so
Yeah.
they went
They
from
got
being the
smoked.
eighth seed, yeah, to just being out. So I
Yeah.
mean, that's the rough part. And again, that could happen again, right? Where like, let's say they're like 9 or 10, and then they have to match up against one of these other teams like a New Orleans or somebody else like that that's kind of in that similar sphere standings wise.
Hmm.
That would not be great.
Yeah.
That would not be a good position to be in where it's down to one game because you could just have a scenario just like this where something crazy happens at the end and
Right.
then that's it. But with the Kings, they're 10-6 after this game. They lost to the Clippers. It was on the second night of the back-to-back, right, where they got blown out.
Hmm.
So now they're 10-7. I don't know how to feel about the team because on the one hand, I do feel like Malik Monk, or not Malik Monk, De'Aaron Fox has definitely taken a step forward with his game. Right, he had 29 in this game, 9 of 20 from the field, 2 of 8 from three, 9 of 17 from the line, which was atrocious.
Yeah.
If the Kings had
Yeah.
lost that game, that would have been where they would have lost is just by
Yeah.
missing so many free throws. And most of them came from him, but it definitely feels like he's taken a step forward. Um, but at the same time, like some of the other issues with the team don't really feel like they've really been fixed. I know Keegan Murray was out, so that makes a difference, but it still feels like, you don't have like a whole lot of collective size. I know they have the forwards, but like Barnes, is just not like a super physical, matchup, defensively. And neither is Murray, right? Like, I mean, those guys are just kind of like, I guess like, 3-and-D type guys, right? But, with Barnes, it's more so just like kind of like a poor man scoring forward guy. You know what I mean? And then
Yeah.
Sabonis, right? He didn't have a great game this game.
It
And
was
then he
pretty
didn't have
bad.
that. Yeah, he had what, he was 2 for 7, nine
Yeah.
points, did have 10 assists and
Yes.
8 rebounds, but it still kind of felt a little bit, reminiscent of what happened in the postseason last year.
Hmm.
And I just and it could just be like this type of team is just not a good matchup for him, where
He
it's like
can't
they're
bully them.
small. Yeah, it's like they're small, but they're still kind of physical. And it's also like he's not a comfortable outside shooter.
Right.
So it's like, they're giving him the jumpers and he doesn't want to take them. And then he's like, well, I'm just going to go into traffic and just try to score over,
Yeah.
these two guys, who are smaller than me, but they're still, tough physical guys. And it's just not great.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where, again, that's where, like, for me, that's where the Kings at times, like I said, they're not the same in terms of fraud watch because we don't look at them as like a championship
Right.
contender. But this is a team where it's like, I don't think they can really come out of the West because it just feels like they're just missing, another guy. You know what I mean? Like if they
Yes, I
had like
get you.
another guy that was pretty, if they had another guy that was pretty consistent in the starting group, because I know Malik Monk off the bench can, do some stuff and he plays a ton of minutes, so he might as well be like a sixth starter. But it's just I feel like they're missing another piece, right? Sasha Vezenkov, right? He came off the bench. And even though he was 3 for 9, he actually did have like a lot of key moments where he kind of got him back into the game, where he just made some really energizing plays.
Yeah.
Did made some wild decisions as well, but still, like, he was a big part. I mean, plus 17 in terms of plus minus in a
Yeah.
1 point win. So obviously, right, it was the right decision. They were playing like a ton of guys. I think they played like 12 guys in the first quarter. So you could see Mike Brown was kind of looking for answers. And, without Keegan Murray, you kind of had to figure out ways to make things up,
Yeah. It's tough.
to make up for his absence. But I don't know. It was just a strange situation where, like, you looked at the Kings and they looked kind of, I guess, in some ways at times bigger than Golden State just because, of, Sabonis and some of these other guys. And then also, like, with the Gary Payton absence, I mean, the guards just kind of ate Golden State,
Yeah.
you know, up where it's like there was nothing they could do, right? Which again makes sense. I mean, I like, in terms of their guards, it's Steph, right? It's Clay, and then it's Gary Payton, right? I mean, like, and then after that, right, Chris Paul. I guess Corey Joseph came in because Chris Paul was hurt, but none of those guys are going to be able to stay in front of quick guards. It's Payton, and that's why that loss hurts as well. In addition to Chris Paul, because now that means that, these teams that have these explosive offensive guards, it's going to be rough. But with Sacramento, there've been guys, that they've been linked to. Some of those guys we like in terms of what they could get. Other guys not so much. So that's how I feel about them. Where it's like, they seem like they're kind of in a similar spot to last year. I think their offense has taken a step back in terms of like the advanced stats or whatever, but the
Hmm.
defense is better. But it's still kind of like all in all, kind of comes out to just okay. Where it's like, again, that's why I think if you had another guy, that would probably help, especially if it was like some type of forward, because then I think that would add a little bit more size and physicality, because I feel like that's kind of what they need.
Yeah, and it's funny because
It can't just be Fox, and then like even though Sabonis has a number of good games, you just know there's going to be some matchups where he's going to be a little bit overwhelmed, and that's where, like I said, that's where it would help to have a consistent third guy.
yeah, and it's funny because I remember when we did our offseason breakdown and what we thought that the Kings were gonna do. A couple of people were like, "You're still sleeping on them," like, and it's like, yeah, I think I will because I'm not really sure how to feel about this team. I think you hit the nail on the head where you're like, yeah, De'Aaron Fox has taken the leap, but the team itself has really not taken any leap. They're kind of in the same spot as last year, and I think that's due for a first round flame out or, potentially not even really making the playoffs. I don't know. We'll see. Cause I don't feel good about the 10-6 record. It's like a record where I don't look at it as like great, I don't know. I don't know. It's just hard for me to gauge the Kings because I feel like they're so inconsistent. Um, but the defense is really tough for me to watch sometimes. Offensively, I do like what they do. And I think, it really can is all contingent on making shots. I know that's a thing for every team, but this is one of those teams where it's like if Herter's not hitting, Malik Monk's not hitting, if Fox isn't hitting, this team's not going anywhere. So I think consistency is definitely a something that they need to really work on because 34% from the three and then 64% from the free throw. That's kind of ugly. Most of it being the bulk of Fox missing a lot of free throws. And then 45% from the field. It's just not great. This was an ugly win, and like you said, and like I said, we both felt like Golden State pretty much handed the game to the Kings in this situation.
Um, yeah, but I mean, either way, it is kind of wild, but like you said, the point differential thing definitely was kind of confusing, I think for a lot of people. Because again, it mentioned, in terms of this game, came down to, right, whether or not either the Kings won or if they lost by, 11 or fewer, right, they get in, or if the Warriors win by more than by 12 or more, they would have gotten in. I wonder, like, if you're the Kings, how would you have handled that game where, say, like, you lost the game, but you only lost by like a few points, so you moved on to the next part of the in-season
Yeah,
tournament, but you lost the game? Like, how would you react? Like, in
I
terms of
know,
like,
right?
what would the locker room vibe be like? Because that seems like that's a situation where I think that'd be kind of weird. Because it's like you'd be celebrating, but you also lost.
I
So
don't think they'd
which
be
one would?
celebrating, honestly. I think
Yeah,
they would kind of just not really care that they made it in the moment. I think, they would move on from the loss, whenever they go to practice or whatever the case may be, whatever the system is. But then like in the heat of the moment, they're not gonna feel good about a loss. I don't think anybody ever is gonna feel good about a loss. Um so now I guess what should we look at, what the tournament is looking like now, like bracket wise? Because I
yeah. So
think
I mean, I,
Boston plays Indy.
yeah. So yeah, in terms of the next round, right? That's the knockout bracket,
Yeah.
right, or whatever. So now you have the quarterfinals, right? Where in the West you got two groups. You have Lakers, or not groups, but you have two matchups, right? Lakers and Suns. That's
Hmm.
December 5th. At LA, right? Because they were the leader in that group. And then you have Kings, um, and the Pelicans, right?
Yeah.
But it's Sacramento, right? Because Sacramento ended up winning that group. So those are your West matchups, and then in the East, you have the Bucks and the Knicks, right? That's in Milwaukee, and then you have the Pacers and the Celtics, right? And that's at Indiana. Who went undefeated in that group. So that's your bracket, and then after that, the winners of those, right, will meet each other in the semifinals in Vegas, right? And then the winners of those obviously will meet for the championship
Yes, sir.
in Vegas as well. So, it should be an interesting time
Yeah.
in terms of the groups. Like I said, it's just been kind of a wild ride for the in-season tournament in the sense of like, there were a number of people, some people were mixed about it, others were high on it. I mean,
Yeah.
I was pretty excited about it just because I just felt that like it was something new. It would give you a chance, to just give some regular season games a little bit more meaning, right? Because they do
Sure.
count as regular season games. But, again, we've saw with a lot of these matchups, they really felt like playoff games, because, even aside from the Kings Warriors ones, right? Like there were a number of matchups prior to that we had talked about where they were, kind of back and forth games that had a lot of excitement and entertainment behind them. So I would consider this a massive success
Yeah, me
for
too.
the NBA. It's just like you said, just a little bit more tweaking in terms of explaining the rules a little bit better. And then maybe changing a couple other things, like, maybe, the amount of games or like, maybe, a scenario where like, some of the teams like play all at the same time, right? So like that way, like it's not a situation where like you go into the game where it's like, oh, this is what we have to do, right? You just kind of have to go in and play, right? So that way you're not like, 'cause how, like in the end of the regular season, right, when teams are kind of jockeying for playoff
Yeah.
positioning, and then
It's
teams
like
will be like,
legal
oh,
point shaving.
yeah, and it's like, oh, we need to lose this game so that way we can match up against this team, or oh, we just have them all play at the same time at times. So,
I
but
agree.
other than that, I think they found something here with the in-season tournament.
Yeah. Do we have any early picks, based on the knockout round? Because I feel like, now the group play is over, I think it's a little bit easier to predict who's probably going to win some of these matchups. So I guess, do you want to go ahead and pick some?
It might be. It's just at the same time, like, some of these I don't know. Cause like, say like I would imagine the Bucks would probably be favored over the Knicks just because, again, the offensive firepower, compared to the Knicks. But then like Indiana and Boston, it's like, Boston is obviously a much better defensive team than Indiana. But in a one game setting, you could have a scenario where Indiana just, shoots the lights out, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it's one game. They could pull off one game against Boston in terms of a win. Sacramento and the Pelicans, right? Obviously, that's a matchup of two teams that got a lot going for them, in terms of a lot of players. But at the same time, it's like with Sacramento, do they match up great against the Pelicans? Do the Pelicans match up great against the Kings? And then also who's playing, right? Because like say like with the Lakers and Suns, who that like you're assuming if guys are healthy they're gonna play. But say like with the Suns right now, like say it's Booker and Durant. Booker got hurt in the last game. He ended up coming back,
Yeah.
right? But again,
It was a
like at the
sprained
same time,
ankle, right?
who's yeah, exactly. So that's the issue of who's going to be available. But I would still feel like most of the home teams would have an advantage. Like
Hmm.
Indiana at home, I feel like is probably better suited to win one game against Boston than if they were in Boston, right?
Hmm.
And then say like Sacramento at home because their crowd is very raucous, right? You would imagine they would probably be better at home than say like a than if they had to go to New Orleans, right? Um, Milwaukee, I don't think it really matters too much, for them. I think they're just a better team than the Knicks.
Sure.
And then for like the Lakers, Suns, right? They're in LA, right? And they're much better at home than they are on the road.
Hmm.
And they've already beaten the Suns a couple of times, so it's like you would think that they'd have the edge, but you just never know because again, in a one game setting, somebody could go off and then you end up losing.
Yeah. I'm gonna take Phoenix. I think hopefully they'll be healthy. But I'm gonna take them in a one game setting. I think, offensively they might be a little bit too much for the Lakers. But we've already seen them match up a few times, so I might just be pulling for the underdog there. I'm taking New Orleans over the Kings. Like I said, Kings are a little bit more on my fraud watch list. Definitely higher on the Pelicans, especially
I would
with
take
what they
New
can
Orleans.
do. I think Zion's going to bully the heck out of Sabonis. And then I think they're going to be pesky against De'Aaron Fox. I think they'll be able to slow them down, hopefully. And then obviously taking Milwaukee. I think that's a no-brainer. Offensive firepower. New York Knicks. I know they'll fight to the end. Whatever the score may be, but I don't think it's going to be a pretty one.
They already
Uh,
played each other. The
yeah.
Bucks won last. So
Exactly. And then Boston, Indiana. I think this is probably the toughest one to gauge, but I'm gonna
yeah,
take Boston.
I
I
think
think
so too.
I don't know. For some reason, I can just feel that Boston's gonna have a very serious mentality because I feel like some teams at this point didn't care about the in-season tournament. You could tell some really didn't care, and some clearly do. And I think Boston is one of those teams where it's like, yeah, they're doing everything in their power to get in this thing. And they're a competitive team, and they've always been that way. So I'm gonna take Boston over Indy.
I think also the other factor with the Pelicans that helps that's, in their favor as well is that some of these guys that were out for a while now they're coming back, right? Like McCollum's back. Trey Murphy's supposed to be back at the end of this week, right? If I'm not, I think it's supposed to be tomorrow,
Okay.
or I guess if you're watching it on Friday, it'll be Friday. So
Yeah.
that helps as well, right? So I think that's where, like I said, if both teams are healthy, right? Like even though the Pelicans have a worse record, I just feel like they have a little more talent than the Kings.
Sure.
And then, like you said, Bucks, Knicks. Yeah, I think the Bucks. That's the easy one right there. And then Celtics, Pacers. Like I said, that one is tough just because again, the Indiana when they're at home they play really well. I think Boston's, Porzingis I guess is out, but at the same time, like in a one game scenario, you could still have Tatum and Brown go off because it's not like the Pacers will have a whole lot to answer for,
Yeah.
there. And then like you said, Lakers Suns, that's a weird one to gauge, but I feel like just because the Lakers are at home and they'll have more of their guys back because again they've been down a lot of guys recently. That's where I'm probably going to take them, and it
Okay.
seems like they have taken the in-season tournament seriously as well. But so is
Very.
Phoenix. So
Yeah. I think every team here has taken it seriously, which is ironic.
that's why they're here.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but either way, it should be fun.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I don't think the point differential now doesn't matter. Right now, it's
No.
just like if you win, you move on.
Yep.
And now it's more like a regular tournament bracket.
Yes.
So
Think of it like
and-
March Madness. Think of it literally like
Yeah.
that. Because I think they even called it like Woj, I think, put out a bracket and he called it the Elite Eight. So for anybody who's still confused, don't be anymore. Just brush up on your March Madness rules and then you're pretty much good to go for this thing.
Yeah, and then the winners obviously, they get $500,000, right? And obviously, all these games count towards regular season wins,
Yes.
so that helps as well. So that's why there's another incentive to win.
Yeah.
So
And they get
we
to
got
take that
now-
NBA Cup home.
Yeah, exactly. So it'll be interesting to see who ends up pulling it out. Who ends
Yeah.
up being the first in-season tournament winner.
'Cause
And
I
again,
think-
like I said, we both liked it when
Yeah.
it was first announced. Again, we were still kind of confused by the rules, but again, we were still all for it, and now I think everybody sees why it was such a good idea in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of funny. Like some of the teams that we had mentioned initially when it first kind of started being a thing at the beginning of the season, and we were trying to do very, very, very early predictions, and looking at the groups. I think I had talked about Dallas, Denver, and those guys are nowhere to be found. So it's just interesting to see who's really in this thing.
Yeah, but you just never know because
I like the matchups though.
Yeah, exactly, and it's kind of funny, right? Say like a game, like a team like Dallas, right, where they won their last game, right, but obviously they didn't do enough to be able to, move on to the next
Right.
group. Or again, like we saw teams that didn't necessarily do great, but point differentials they did just enough to be able to move on.
Right.
So that's kind of the funny thing. So
Yeah.
I mean, here we are. So.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're moving on into the next segment pretty much, which is just like I guess at this point more news and rumors. Obviously we're getting closer to December 15th and January 15th, right? That's the time when more contracts will be available to trade around the
Yeah.
league. So obviously now everybody's kind of talking about guys that might potentially be on the move. So Hoops Hype, right? Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype, right? So they spoke with multiple executives and league sources, kind of talking about some of the top trade candidates, from different teams. I'm not going to go over all of them, right? Because some of them are guys that you may not care about as much, but some of them are guys where it's not really much of a surprise, right? Like say for Atlanta, right? Like a DeAndre Hunter, right? That's no surprise there.
Right.
Charlotte, right? Like a Gordon Hayward, right? Obviously we know with the Bulls, right? Obviously their guys, right? Levine, DeRozan, Caruso, right? We know that. But and then you kind of move on into some of these other teams, right? Say like a Cleveland and Isaac Okoro, or Dallas,
Ooh.
Tim Hardaway Jr., Rashawn Holmes, right? Detroit, all their vets, right? We've talked
Figure.
about Detroit before, right? In the sense of like something weird is going on there, where it's like that team is just absolutely horrible. I
They
thought
haven't
that they would be
progressed.
better. Yeah. Like I thought that they would be better this season. I mean, I don't think either of us like thought that they would be great. Like I think you thought that they would be worse than the Wizards. But at
Yeah.
the same time, like, I thought they would be better just because I felt like they have talent. Like they have guys on the team that like
Yeah.
are not horrible basketball players.
Right.
And when I watched them, the other night, against the Lakers, right? And it's like they just looked horrible. And like I mean, they haven't won a game since October. I think
Yeah.
I think actually when we first covered like the first couple of
They were
the
2-0.
first piece of basketball, yeah, they were 2-0,
Yeah.
and we were talking about how much better they looked, and then since then they haven't won a single game.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of wild what's going on there. I mean, it's just kind of just bad. Like you just kind of
Yeah.
feel bad for
I do. I
if you're-
genuinely
if
do.
if you're a Detroit Pistons fan, I just feel bad because like
Yeah.
that situation is a mess. I mean,
I'm
like
yeah.
again, like and like you gave the coach like an $80 million+ contract, and it just seems like nothing's worked out, right? Like Nobody's really gotten better aside from, maybe a few guys, but the team
If
also
that.
isn't really much better. The construction of the roster doesn't make any sense. It just sucks.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Detroit, I they've been rebuilding like since I was a kid. But I mean,
Yeah.
come on, bro. Like this is ridiculous. And it's like they have some studs, they have some ballers, they have some guys that get posted on Instagram. They have some guys that have some really good numbers. Especially like Asor Thompson or Duran. But I mean, I think the main thing is the guard play has been very inconsistent, and I think you need a good PG. I know Cade is a great like facilitator, but at the same time, he's averaging goddamn 4 turnovers. So it's like, come on, man. It seems like his scoring, his efficiency has been down. I think he's just not taking the leap that we were expecting him to take. And it seemed like he was balling on another level, like through the first 3 or 4 games, and then something just happened. I don't know. Maybe he'll pick
Yeah.
it back up, but I think he has potential to be an All NBA, All Star kind of guy. It's just this season isn't really working out for him.
Yeah, I think, some of it is the team around him is a
Sure.
mess. And then I also feel like, some of these other guys, that we saw like in year 2 or 3, I think we got kind of spoiled in terms of like how good those guys were like that quickly. And like
Right.
not everybody progresses that quickly, right? Like he could, like you said, he could still be really good down the line. He just may not necessarily take as big of a leap from year to year.
Yeah.
Because take a guy like a Luca, right? Where like in his second year, he's in the playoffs and he's basically going toe to toe with Kawhi and Paul George.
Right.
But that's not the norm for every young player, right?
Right.
Like obviously we've got a lot of young guys that are coming in that are already very good, but just in terms of generally what we've seen before, it takes a little bit of time. And we'll see. Maybe he just ends up not quite being as good as we would have hoped, but
Maybe.
I'm still not out on him. It's just I would like to see a little bit more structure put in place because it also just kind of is like at a point where it seems like, and I'm not blaming this on the players, but it just seems like because now like they've been so accustomed to just losing games left and right, it sort of feels like where Houston was.
Yeah.
You
They have
know,
a bad
we talked
culture.
about that. Yeah, where we talked about them last year and just how terrible it was and how they just needed a reset. And it seems like Houston was able to kind of get out of it. So hopefully Detroit's able to do that, but obviously not this year. So
Yeah. I'm thinking they got to move on from somebody like Ivy. Maybe even like James Wiseman, just guys who really aren't doing much of anything. I know Jaden Ivey's played a little bit better recently, but a guy like Wiseman's got to go. And obviously, like you were saying with the vets, I think everybody who probably isn't like a core piece of this organization will probably be on the move. Kind of similar to the Wizards, where it's like they're just gonna continue building for the future, I guess.
moving on to some other teams that were mentioned in the article. Golden State, right? That was a team that was also talked about. Kaminga, Moody, and Chris Paul, right? I think that makes sense because, like I said, I
Mm,
just don't think they're gonna get rid of any of those core guys.
mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like, who are you gonna get? You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, if you're not gonna move any of those core guys, right, and you're gonna combine those contracts together, could that be a Siakam team? Could that be,
Mm.
again, a Levine team? Who knows? I mean, like, but I do feel like they need something.
Yeah, I don't really know how to feel about that. I don't know if that's like supposed to be a package or if those guys are supposed to
Right.
be separate. But I think each one of those guys you could get a decent return value for. But if it is a
Yeah.
complete package and like a pick or something, I mean, I could
Yeah.
see
And
them
it's
getting Siakam or something like that or somebody like
yeah.
that.
Like it's rough because again, like Moody, it seems like he's a good young player,
Yeah.
but for them, it just kind of hurts that like they did whiff on some of those picks, right? Like they whiffed on the Wiseman pick.
Yeah.
It seems like they whiffed on the Kaminga pick, where it's
Yeah.
just like you got, those are two top 10 draft picks that you put a lot of time into hoping that they might be good. Not in
Yeah.
terms of investing, because I don't think they did a good job in terms of investing and
No.
developing them, but
They sold.
the fact yeah, the fact that you had to, because Moody was like the 14th pick, which
Yeah.
is still the lottery, but because that's the end of it, like you don't feel as bad if you
Right.
whiffed on the 14th pick
But I
as
think
you
he's
would
been
if you,
great.
yeah, but like compared to like if you whiff on the number 2 pick,
Yeah, it's bad.
or the number 2nd pick, like that's rough, especially like because with the Wiseman pick, right, the guys right around him and Edwards and Lamelo, right, those guys obviously have panned out pretty well, especially Edwards, and then um you look at the draft with Kaminga, right? Franz Wagner was there. Obviously that's rough. You look at what he's doing in
Yeah,
Orlando.
should have
So
traded the pick or something, man. Either trade the pick or just draft better. But I do understand why they did pick James Wiseman. Like I can't fault them for that,
yeah,
because at the
right.
time, I mean, Wiseman was kind of a glitch coming out of high school, where it was like, one of those weird 7-footers that could do everything. But then small sample size in college, missed all the time. But yeah, I do understand why they picked him, but we can't ignore the fact that it is a miss because look at him now. I mean, he's not really doing anything in the league. On 11 minutes
Exactly.
on Detroit. Come on, man.
That's why drafting is difficult because, again, they did a great job drafting a number of other guys, but then
Yes.
sometimes you just have misses. And, with the Wiseman pick, like you said, most people thought that that was a solid pick because,
And they needed a
even though a lot
big.
of people were like, yeah, because even though a lot of people were like, well, LaMelo might be a better player, most people were like, well, Wiseman's the good fit. And because the
Hmm.
Warriors were like your typical lottery team, they just had a bad year because they had a bunch of injuries.
Yeah.
They weren't in the same spot as those other teams where they had to pick, like the next guy,
Right.
to build around. They didn't have to do
Yeah,
that.
they
But
still had
at
Steph, Clay,
right.
Dre. They had
And at the
everything.
same time, yeah, and like we said before, as I've mentioned multiple times, all of the top guys in that draft, people had questions about, because at
Yes.
the time it was considered not even a good draft, right? Even
Right.
a guy like Anthony Edwards, who's awesome now, there were a lot of people, including people who talk highly about him now, right, that were not that high on him when he was first
Yeah.
drafted.
They're like, he doesn't care about the
So
game of basketball. Even like people who were interviewing him, like the Warriors, they didn't want him, which is
yeah,
crazy.
right. And again, like same thing with Wiseman, right? Like you mentioned, small sample size, didn't play a lot past high school. So
Hmm.
some people were like, he's raw, but you would think with Golden State's, track record, he would probably work out there. And
Yeah,
then with
right.
LaMelo, right? People have questions about him because people had questions about his maturity,
Yes.
amongst other things. So I mean, that's why drafting is hard. But moving on, to some other teams, right? Houston, right? Not much to say there. I mean, they mentioned, some of their guys that aren't playing like an Oladipo or like a Jock Landale or even like a Jeff Green or a Reggie Bullock, those guys could be moved. Which makes sense because again, if you're Houston, there's no reason to be bad, so you might,
Right.
might as well. And some of those guys aren't even playing, so you might as well just move them and bring in somebody who can help who can help you, as
Yeah.
opposed to some of those guys who are just kind of just there on the roster. Um,
Makes sense to me.
yeah, and then Indiana, we've talked about them before, right? Where maybe a T.J. McConnell, Buddy Hield's name has come up, although he's starting, so we'll see, and he's been playing very well. The Clippers, right? Norman Powell, Bones Highland makes sense, right? Because with Highland, he's not even really playing anymore since Westbrook's moved to the second unit, and then Powell, just feels kind of like a little bit a little bit more duplicative, just because you already have other guards. I mean, I know obviously compared to Westbrook and Harden, he's more comfortable catching and shooting. And he can play downhill, but at the same time, he's not that great defensively, and he still
Right.
makes a lot of money. You might just, want to move him for some other pieces. We'll see, but
I think
they've
that all
definitely
makes
been another,
sense.
yeah, they've definitely been another one of those underwhelming teams. They did get the blowout win over the Kings, and maybe that's the turnaround, but at the same time, like it just hasn't worked. I mean, they had a loss against the Nuggets, right? And maybe that's just the blip, right, where the three Nuggets guys didn't even play, right? And Reggie Jackson and DeAndre Jordan turned into, the prime versions of themselves. And
Pretty much.
it definitely feels like a trend where they haven't done a good job of being able to stick with guards, and they haven't done a great job of being able to guard bigs, other than I guess like a Sabonis, but still.
I mean, that basically means you're going to lose almost every game that you play because you basically just talked about two of the most important positions in basketball, especially with the skills and the guys that we have in the league right now. I mean, not being able to guard a point guard and a center, I don't know. That's red flags.
Right. Next up, another LA team, the Lakers, right? D'Lo and Rui Hachimura, right? Those are names that have come up,
Hmm.
obviously, because in terms of only because I think in terms of the contracts, right? Because obviously you're not trading LeBron or AD, and they already
No.
can't really do much of anything until like December, January, anyways. Because again, we already talked about it, right? A lot of their guys were either re-signed or newly signed, so a lot of those guys can't be moved. But it is interesting because I feel like those two guys have played pretty well. Rui hasn't played a lot because he's been hurt a few times, right, with a concussion and a nasal fracture. But D'Lo for the most part, he's played very well. I think he's been their best guard this season, and I think
Yes.
if you are to trade him, I think you need to be a little careful about who you bring back because I feel
Hmm.
like you still kind of need a guy that can kind of run some of your offense, as opposed to just like a pure scorer, just in order to help LeBron, not have to run quite as much of the offense, especially in the regular season.
Yeah, I don't really understand the D'Lo rumor. I think that's a guy that you need to keep around 100%, and Rui as well. I don't know. I feel like that's kind of just blowing smoke up our you know what's, but it is what it is. I really don't agree with that rumor at all, and I wouldn't
Yeah.
I wouldn't want them to do that to move either of
Yeah,
them.
yeah, and that's the thing. Like say with the Zach Levine scenario, where because he makes $40 million, right? Those two guys kind of have to be plugged into automatically any
The
move that you
Lakers
make.
don't need Zach
Unless you
Levine
trade.
though.
Yeah, like I mean, again, my take on it as a Lakers fan is I understand where people are coming from in terms of why they think he would, be a really good addition just because their offense has been significantly worse than expected, particularly compared to the defense. Where their defense has pretty much been, in the top tier, whereas the offense has been in the bottom tier. So I can understand that, right? And I think part of that people are looking at the guards where it's like the combination of the guards they have none of those guys really like are that great at being able to kind of like blow past guys, get downhill. So I get it. It's just the issue is that you're kind of looking at a similar situation to kind of like what happened with Westbrook, where you just gave up too much for a guy. Where is he really going to be the guy to put you over the top? That's kind of the question that you have to answer if you're going to be trading for a third star. Is this guy the guy? Where if you have him, like is that the right move? Because that's where you have to be careful. Because again, like if it was like, if it was somebody that was like in a tier higher than Zach Levine, then yeah, go for it. But I'm just not sure about that because I just feel like, there are parts of his game where it's like, if you give up those other guys, like you're gonna be missing those holes, right? Because you won't have a guy who can, kind of run your offense. Because like Levine's more of a scorer, right? He's not really like
Yeah.
I know he came in sort of at times as a point guard, but he's a scorer, right? He's not
Yeah,
really
he's a
looking to
two
like
guard.
yeah, he's not really looking to distribute the ball or run offense for other guys. He's looking to
No.
score. And then like defensively, right? He's not a great defender. He's
No.
got the physical tools for it, but at this point, is he all of a sudden going to turn into a great defender? I don't know,
No.
maybe, but
No.
that's the issue where it's just like I don't know about that. I would personally prefer something different. Again, we'll
Yeah.
see, but like you said, I would kind of stay away from the Levine thing. I like if it happened, okay, there's nothing I can do about it, but it wouldn't be my first choice. I think a smaller trade. And also like I would like to see just more games with a lot of the other guys, right? Because there's been so many guys that have been out. I would like to see maybe like 75% of the team back as opposed
Yeah.
to like, seeing, like a Max Christie in the starting lineup. And not that he's horrible or bad or anything, but just, I would like to see more games where most of their guys are back outside of, whatever.
Yeah. I don't know. Like I said, not very high on that rumor, and it seems like every year there's a disgruntled star. I mean, everybody is screaming that person's going to LA. I get it, it's LA. They got all the buzz and whatnot, but it kind of gets annoying. Like I just don't see the Lakers trading for Zach Levine. I think that would be more of a loss than a win.
Like, yeah, yeah, that's how I feel too. Where it's just like, again, I understand what he brings in terms of the positives. I just feel like in terms of the contract, that's the problem. I just don't know if I feel comfortable giving up, multiple guys for a guy that I'm not necessarily sure makes your team significantly better. Like he's better than those guys, but does he make your team by himself individually better than if you just had those guys? I'm just not
Hurts the
sure.
depth chart a lot. Too much for me.
Right. And then moving on, some of these others are not much of a surprise. Say like for Miami, right? Obviously, Hero, Lowry, Robinson, they're going to continue to be in rumors because again,
Yep.
those are the contracts that are the bigger, more tradable ones.
Yep.
Because again, like Hero was in rumors all off season, right? So I don't think that's going to go away
Mm-mm.
anytime soon, even though he was playing well before he got hurt. And then obviously Lowry's a big expiring deal, and then Duncan Robinson, right? Is playing some of the best basketball now of his career. So now I think that contract might be a little bit more, viable to other teams. But
Yeah.
we'll see. But it does make sense.
Yeah.
And then Memphis, right? We have already talked about them. At times in terms of how this season has definitely not gone the way for them. Luke Kennard and John Conchar, right? Again, role players. Eh, not necessarily guys that I would want to pick up, but again, I don't think they're going to move any of their other guys.
Yeah.
But 'cause again, like with say like a Marcus Smart, they gave up multiple picks to get him, so I don't think they're going to trade for him and then just be like, oh well, now we're just going to get rid of him. I mean,
Yeah.
you
That
might
wouldn't
have
be smart.
yeah, and then other teams, right? Milwaukee, Pat Connaughton, we've already mentioned that before. Minnesota, Carl Anthony Towns, right? We've mentioned that before. Only just because again, like down the line, like, and it's in it
I
the
get it.
preface yeah, the preface was more so if Minnesota once again doesn't go past the first round,
Right.
right? That's where they're gonna make some type of
I,
Knicks
it just it's
Fournier.
just the way that you said it. I was like, why would they trade him if he's playing, really good basketball? But that was definitely something we talked about during the off season.
Right. Yeah. Philadelphia, right? Obviously, all their role guys. We've known about that.
Yeah.
Portland obviously has a number of guys, right? Like a Malcolm Brogdon, Jeremy Grant, right? We've talked about them. Sacramento, Davion Mitchell. That's kind of a
Hmm.
name that's interesting because he definitely hasn't panned out quite as I think how they would have hoped, right? Where I think his rookie season he was fine, but since
Two-way
then he just
monster.
hasn't really, yeah, yeah, but since then just hasn't really done a whole lot.
Nope.
Mainly just because his offense is just not really that good.
Yeah.
But, obviously his main thing obviously is his defense, I guess. But
Mm-hmm.
because he's not much of an offensive player and he's so small,
Yeah.
right? Like there's just gonna be some games where like as good of defense as he might play, he's just gonna be overwhelmed. And then if he doesn't do much on offense, that's not gonna help either.
Yeah, it's kind of hard watching him play sometimes because I love the effort, 100%. I love the effort, and I do think he does make some great defensive plays. But offensively, like you said, it's a poop show. It's very hard to watch sometimes, especially when it's like he tries to force it. I do like that he does get to the line, but yeah, that wasn't really something that I had really thought of them moving on from him. But I wouldn't really mind it. But at the same time, their defense isn't the best, so maybe you need to keep him around. I don't know.
I guess the thought process is that if you keep him, you're gonna have to pay him, and is it worth keeping?
Right.
Is it worth paying him?
Right.
Because again, he hasn't really panned out, and it's like you don't really need him as much now. Now that you have like De'Aaron Fox and Malik Monk, you kind of just need probably a back, like just a traditional backup point guard that can
Right.
kind of help run your offense when one of those guys is off the floor.
Right.
Toronto, right? We already know, right? They got a bunch of guys available. We've already talked about that, but they just don't seem to want to ever get rid of those guys. We'll see. Um, Utah, right? Obviously Sexton,
Mhm.
THT, Kelly Olynyk, right? I think those names make sense. I think Olynyk is probably the one that I feel like a lot of teams might be, like playoff teams might be more interested in,
Right.
just because of the fact that like I think he's an expiring deal, and just the fact he's been in some playoff games and he can provide some value, on both ends of the floor, especially offensively as a floor spacer. So and he can pass. So I feel like Olynyk is probably the most attractive trade target of those three, but I
Yeah,
could be wrong.
I agree with you because I think he brings a lot to the table.
And then Washington, right? That's
Huh.
your team.
Joy.
Um, right? Again, like you mentioned, the vets, right? Like Delon Wright, Landry Shamet, Gallinari, Mike Muscala, right?
Yeah.
Like that's no surprise, right? Because we talked about that in the offseason where, you know, they are kind of set, to potentially make some moves at the deadline. Not necessarily to pick up like great players,
No.
but just to be like a team that's gonna, be a seller, right? Where it's
Yep.
like, hey, you're a team, that's a playoff team that needs another rotational guy. We got some rotational guys,
Now
right? Like,
give us your second rounders.
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, you're probably not going to get a whole lot for them, but you'll get more than just by having them there or by not
Yeah.
or whatever. Like I mean, like yeah, like you said, they may only get second round picks, but that's
Yeah.
better than nothing.
I mean, there's a
Um,
clear direction. You're on a bad team, and I'm talking to Mike Muscala here. And this isn't an attack on his character or his play or anything like that. You're on a bad team. You're the backup center, and you still don't play. Gallinari is the center, the backup center. So it's like, yeah, he's not going to be here. So they're just there, like you said, to fill spots at that point because you don't want to be too young. It's always good to have vets around, and then we can move them, get some assets for the future. That's the way I'm looking at it. Season's a wash for Washington.
um, and then now into the final news rumors going on. So Kelly Oubre, right? He could potentially make his return next week, right?
Okay.
Obviously we had talked about that situation where it seemed like it was starting to inch closer to instead of being out for months, right? Just weeks. So obviously that's a good sign for Philadelphia because he was playing some great basketball
Yeah.
before before he left the team. Obviously with the stuff going on, so it'll be good to have him back because again, when he's played, he's been a big help to them on the offensive end.
Yeah.
Well,
He's
I
been
guess that
Yeah.
on both ends,
I
but
think he I think
mainly
he's
on.
been very good. And it's
Yeah, exactly.
unfortunate. You can see that they have missed him at times. Um, but at other times, the depth that they did acquire from the Clippers, I think, has helped them out in a lot of cases. But it'll be nice to really have him back, and he can continue to ball out.
Exactly. And then moving on, we already talked about Trey Murphy, right? Where obviously that's a big, boost for New Orleans, right? Because again, McCollum was already back, and now Murphy he's going to be back soon. So that will help kind of shore up some of the depth issues that New Orleans has had. Because again, it's been rough, at times for them in some of
Yeah.
these games where they've had games where they look very good. And then they've had other games where, some guys have been out and it just hasn't been good enough. So,
Yeah.
hopefully with the return of, guys like a Trey Murphy, right, who I think is, again, because of what he can do on both ends of the floor, right, size and athleticism, that's a guy that I think, should help out. But then also then you have other bad news, right, where like Larry Nance, right, he's going to be out at least 4 weeks because he
Yep.
re-aggravated, the rib fracture injury that he had.
Yeah, I mean it's a never-ending cycle with New Orleans. Unfortunately, it seems like they can never really stay healthy, and we'll never really know why that is. Because now it's not really Zion or Ingram; it's more so the other guys, which I think hurts you just as much.
Then moving on, more returns. Bojan Bogdanovic, right, to
Great.
return, on I guess Saturday. So that's kind of interesting.
Okay.
Um, just in the regards to that's another veteran, that might come back, that can probably help them. I mean, they're still going to be bad, but
Yeah, still gonna be
again, I'm
atrocious.
also curious to see what they do with him from a trade standpoint, right? Because obviously he was in a ton of rumors last year, and I think,
Every
uh,
week.
yeah, exactly. There was a stretch where we were talking about him every week, and I think I saw
Oh
the
my
other
god.
day, right? Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype, I think they had put out that there was like a potential deal that would have gotten them like 2 first-round picks for Bogdanovich. I don't know, if that's the case, but if that's the case and they didn't do it, that's pretty bad.
Detroit just sold. Oh my gosh, that's bad. I
Yeah, I
that
mean,
was my legit reaction to that. I didn't know that. That's horrible.
yeah, I mean,
You got to
yes,
move
yeah,
on, bro.
yeah. I'm looking at it just to make sure. Yeah, the Pistons turned down a trade offer of 2 first-round picks, according to Hoops Hype. So that's
That hurts.
pretty.
That
Yeah,
stings, in my opinion. That's
yeah, that's
bad,
pretty
bro. That's
wild because
bad.
again, like he played very well for the Pistons last
Right.
year. Um, and then obviously he got the extension, so maybe maybe some teams were turned off by that, but then clearly they weren't because they were willing to give up picks. And I don't know what the deal was there. It said Detroit had hopes of contending for the play-in or a playoff spot. I mean
Oh,
that's
I
long gone.
I
So I
do
mean,
understand the logic though, because I think everybody expected them to be a little bit better than what they are now. But God,
but like two
they,
first round picks, I think
you can't
if it
pass
was
on
like
that.
yeah, like if it was like one, okay, maybe, but
Right.
like if somebody's giving you multiple picks,
Two.
for a guy who's like a good player, but he's not like a star player. I mean,
That's a
you
steal.
got to yeah, you got it. Yeah, that's a steal. You got to do that.
Because
I
you
mean,
could
and
hit on
especially
two
because
players that can be better than him.
yeah, especially because when they traded for him, they didn't even give up anything, right? I think it was just Olenek, right? Or not even it was just yeah, it was somebody. It
Yeah,
may not have been.
I think it
I think
was
yeah, it was
Olenek.
just Olenek. They didn't even give up picks to get him. So it's like you got a guy where you didn't give up anything in order to get him. You could have flipped him for more than what you gave up to get him. And now it's like I don't think they're gonna get that. I mean, maybe
No,
they do,
probably not.
but yeah, like now he's been hurt. So obviously it'll take him a little bit of time to, kind of get back into a rhythm. That was just a blown
Yeah,
opportunity.
that's a L management.
And that's wild because again, we thought, that they had a pretty good offseason in terms of the stuff that they did, but it
That
is
changes the
definitely
grade to
not.
an F.
Yeah, it is not translated at all, which is just,
No.
it's a shame because again, they have some decent players, and they have, some interesting situations going on, but it's been just bad.
Yeah.
Um, and then Bronny James, right? So apparently, according to Shams Charania, right, it seems like he's on his way back. From his heart condition, obviously that happened. So now they're saying that he's gonna be going through practices right next week, obviously, and then eventually that will transition into a return to the court. So that's pretty awesome because again, he obviously went through it, for a while, and hope now he's got a chance to get back on the court and play, and we'll be able to see what he does.
Yeah. And USC's been hooping. I know that he's now been cleared for basketball activities. So like you said, they'll ease him back into playing basketball, which I know he is anxiously awaiting. But I think it'll be interesting to see what this does for USC because I think they're an interesting team and one to watch for March Madness in the tournament. And then obviously they've got some guys who are clearly going to be NBA bound. Hopefully Bronny will be included in that. We'll see. I think the medical stuff will probably raise questions, but I don't think his stock will plummet due to that. So hopefully he bounces back and shows the world what he's got.
Yeah, the main thing is it's good that he's back and that he's
Yeah,
healthy and he's ready, to be able to play again. So that's
exactly.
that's the most important part. So
Mm-hmm.
props.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know in the comments your thoughts on the in-season tournament. on all the matchups, maybe what your bracket is, and then also all the trade rumors, right? Because obviously, there's a lot going on here, and things will continue to heat up, I think, over the course of the season as we get closer and closer to the deadline when teams, kind of see what they got. But again, also we appreciate all the support that we got, from the TikToks and everything, because we're getting some pretty great views there in
Yeah.
terms of the content and interaction. So we appreciate that. So don't forget to continue to like and subscribe as
Yes,
well as
sir.
comment. Exactly. And I guess we'll see you next week.